midnight oil.
Okay. Stick nice and close. What's your favourite midnight oil song?
My Country.
Oh, nice.
I'll see how we go. Surf's up tonight.
Wedding Cake Island.
No, we don't have Wedding Cake Island's another good one, instrumental. We'll leave it go. We'll stick with that. We'll focus on the chat. Here we go. Pete Townend, Skyhooks living in the 70s. How does it make you feel?
Rest in peace there, Shirley Strawn.
Yeah, you knew Cheryl, didn't you?
Yeah, we all did in that era of the 70s. I mean, the early days of Skyhooks were in Torquay, you know, like in people's parties. I mean, that's where we first got to know those guys.
You were getting about the place, weren't you? Because you grew up on the southern end of the coast. Coolangatta was your stomping ground, but I guess you were just working your way up and down the east coast of Australia, chasing waves at that point.
Well, those early days of the 70s, of course, it was all about the old Aussie titles, and of course, you know, I was in that legendary trip with Rabbit, and we haven't got him on the line.
No,
but
he's missing in action.
In Joe Larkin's van, remember? We in 71, we went on our first trip to Bells in Joe Larkin's van. With MP, Rabbit, myself, and Terry Baker. And, of course, that's the legendary story in MP's book.
What sort of van was it, Pete?
It was like one of those little, well, it wasn't one, it was kind of one of those Ford Econoline vans, you know, like a high one with the boards on the rip top.
It's 18 minutes away from 7. It was the early 1970s, folks. The southern Gold Coast was going off in more ways than one. The waves were pumping, panel vans lined the streets. Boardies were the uniform of choice, and hanging out at the beachside milk bar was the social equivalent of Facebook. It was time in surf history that will never be repeated. Now, a documentary reliving this classic era is currently being screened at the City Gallery, and there'll be a special one-night screening on Friday night at the Commune Resort in Greenmount. It's entitled Sons of Beaches. One of the original Cooley kids, Pete Townend, joins me here in the studio this morning. Pete, when you're talking, you've been living in America for how long now?
Wow, more than half my life, 34 years. I've lived in Huntington Beach.
Still managed to maintain a bit of the Aussie accent too.
Well, I come home every year for a dose of Australian, you know.
For one of those pies you were talking about earlier.
Exactly, mate.
When you're talking to young surfers today, how do you describe that time, that era?
Well, that time was very adventurous, you know, like it was coming off the late 60s, you know, and the icons of our world at that time were Nat and Midget and Peter Druin, and of course we were the next generation. We were the first shortboard generation. We didn't go up on the longboard, and so we were the next generation of Australians surfing. And what was really interesting, at least at the southern end of the Gold Coast, is you know, of course we had those great point breaks of those days. We didn't have Superbank in those days. It was, you know, Snapper, Rainbow, Greenmount and Kira. And with the shortboard generation, we were really starting to learn how to ride the barrel of the wave, which up until the shortboard came along, you know, guys really didn't get barreled. Like once the shortboard came along, that's when barrel riding really began.
Do you remember the first time you stepped onto a surfboard?
The first time I got a board from Joe Larkin in Christmas '67, that was my Christmas present, and that was at Rainbow Bay with a guy called Peter Bryant, who's still around today. He's the mentor of the Snapper Rocks Board Riders Club, and of course I'd been in the clubbies that everyone was in those early days. You know, at Greenmount and Coolangatta, I was in the clubbies there with Michael Peterson. We were in there together, and a couple other guys. Peter Ryan went on to a great football career in Sydney playing for Cronulla, and a whole bunch of people at that time. And then the whole surf club thing was happening. You know, Michael and Rabbit and I were in Kira. And then, if you've read the book, The Legendary Night, when MP was running against me for president of Kira, and he offered the room joints, you know, as one of the things to get a vote, and of course a whole bunch of us stood up and walked out, and that's when Snapper rebirthed in 1974. So that era of the Gold Coast southern end, you know, the Coolangatta end, was just an incredible time. And of course up this way it was the Burleigh scene, you know.
Yes. What was incredible about it, Pete, it strikes me that there was a lot of experimentation going on in more ways than one. I'll leave that up to your imagination. But in terms of surfing, you mentioned people like Nat Young, who'd been riding the longer boards that you looked up to. All of a sudden, 67, you get a short board for Christmas, and you don't really know how to ride these things. You guys are making it up as you go along.
Well, and that's where it's different today. The kids don't, we didn't have videos, and you didn't have the internet, and you couldn't watch a clip every day fresh. What you had to do was wait for the new surf movie to come along, and that's where you learnt what was going on. And if you were lucky enough, you know, a surf superstar might turn up. And let me think, in '71 we had Jerry Lopez and Jeff Hackman roll through town, and I'll never forget. Jerry and I are really great friends today, but at that time he was a god, you know. He's tube riding at Pipeline, and we were trying to tube ride Kira. And I'll never forget walking up to him, you know, brash little PT from Kira, and going, "Hey, listen, I'm PT." And he goes, "I've heard of you. You're that one of those new kids from Kira." And he said, "But Jerry, I got this problem." I go, "We're still getting hung up in the barrel." And he said, "Let me give you a tip." And this tip to this day helped me become a great barrel rider. He said, "You know, when you get in the barrel," he said, "take that leading hand and put it in the center of the cylinder, and you'll always come out." Wow. And I went back to Kira and started doing that, and I started coming out of every barrel. And if you look at my style, you'll see I still do that to this day.
Well, another trademark of your style is the legendary PT arch. Now, for listeners who haven't seen it or haven't heard it, if I can just describe it, you've got Pete Townend, and he's on the board. Arms are up in the air, and he's leaning back in what could almost be described as a bit of a backward yoga arch. How did the PT arch, the legendary PT arch, come about?
Well, it was actually adapted from the '60s on the longboard. They used to do the sole arch bottom turn, and I thought, wow, why can't I do that on a shortboard? You know, because the stability of the longboard allowed it a lot easier. But I went, if I can develop the technique to do it on the shortboard, and just around the time when I went off to do the movie Big Wednesday, I started doing a sole arch, and actually the first day I really did it was at the coat contest in Sydney, you know, in front of any sort of audience. I was warming up in front of the car park at Narrabeen, and I did a beautiful one, and Steve Corr, my mate that's responsible for some of this film here, Sons of Beaches '72, he snapped the picture, and that went in Surfer magazine, and that was it.
Still to this day, it's a classic photo, the old black and white. You must look it up. You had a bit more hair back then, Pete.
Yeah, mate, we all had a bit more hair back those days, you know, and there's a few extra pounds that you weren't around then, you know. It's the gravity gets a hold of you.
How did the documentary come about? I understand that a lot of the material from the documentary surf movie came from your own personal collection of memorabilia.
Yeah, well, I ran into Glenn Blight here about, must be now 6 or 7 years ago, and he'd heard of my collection. So he actually came over, and most of my collection's in America these days. Through the years, I've transported it all over there. And he came, lived in my house for 6 months, and just started going through it. And, you know, I had become a pack rat from the '60s. I'd cut everything out about surfing and put it in a scrapbook, and that just evolved into keeping everything from the heat sheets to the magazines to any clips that came out. And
why did you collect all of that stuff?
My mother was a little bit like that. I think it really comes from my mum. You know, she was an amateur photographer back in the '50s, and she used to cut all sorts of stuff out. And I've actually got all her stuff since she passed away. So I actually have the history of Coolangatta in that respect too. And then it just became a natural thing. I just kept doing it, and now, I mean, I have 2 storage units full of memorabilia in the PT collection.
And how has that all been put together in the documentary?
Well, you're going to see that when I've seen bits and pieces of it, and of course I've seen all the great stuff that I was just looking at the new Gold Coast Surf here, my mate Tony Phillips does, and he has a great collage of stuff in there. So, you know, I haven't seen it all in its entirety since it's been finished, but what I've seen, Glenn's done an incredible job of pulling the elements out in regards to that incredible.
So you haven't seen the doco yet?
I've seen one version of it, but not the final version.
It's going to be exciting Friday night. There's going to be a big reunion, the Commune Resort.
And a lot of the guys that were on that '72 team, not just the Queensland guys, are going to be here. I mean, Doug Warbrick's going to be here, Rod Brooks is going to be here, Mark Warren's going to be here. You know.
Fantastic. What's changed over the years, Pete, in your eyes?
Well, first off, I'll just say one thing: money. But what's really, I think, the most important thing is that we had a dream that pro surfing could be a reality. You know, we were really influenced, even though none of us really played much tennis. Rabbit played a little. That the Newcombs and the Rosewells and the Labors, that could happen to surfing. That was our dream, and that surfers could make $1 million. And the thing that's really cool is it came true. You know, the Slaters and Fannings and all these new kids they're making $1 million.
Do you ever wish you were around today doing what you were doing back then and making that sort of money?
Mate, I wouldn't trade the 70s for anything. I mean, we grew up at the end of the 60s, but our generation was the 70s, and I wouldn't trade those memories, and I wouldn't be doing what I do today. I mean, look, I've just been in Sydney for the Australian Open, working on that event. I'm up here. We're going to go to the World Champion banquet here on Thursday night.
And what keeps you busy back in America these days, Pete Townend?
I have a consultant practice back there involved in the surf industry, so I do strategic branding for some of the bigger companies. I do a little work at the moment for Hurley and the Sanook Sandal Company, and then I'm on a project with a guy I represent, Timmy Turner, for Rip Curl right now, and a little bit of work for the government. I do all sorts of stuff.
You still get out into the waves there at Huntington Beach yourself?
Oh yeah.
And when you're back home too?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the only thing that you can't love about living in Huntington Beach is the cold water. I mean, for a long time.
How cold's cold?
Well, it's cold. I mean, I was saying earlier, in the US would be 54, so I think that's like 16 degrees or 14, 15, somewhere in there, and that's cold.
Final question this morning, Pete. It's been terrific to catch up with you and just feel part of what it was like back in the 70s, surfing here on the southern end of the coast. Where's your favourite break on the coast, and where's your favourite break?
I mean, everybody knows that I was born in the Cura Hospital. It only existed for a short period of time. My grandmother owned the Cura Hotel, so Cura Point, of course, and the times in the 70s and the late 60s, my mate Alan, Miss Campbell, and I used to get up before school, walk over the hill, because we lived up near the Catholic Church, and there'd be no one out, and it'd be 4 to 5 feet. We'd catch a few waves before school, and of course, our reputations, MP, myself, and Rabbit, those were founded out there in those Cura barrels.
Had the place to yourselves. Great to talk to you this morning. All the very best. It's entitled Sons of Beaches 72, the surf documentary. It's currently showing at the City Gallery here on the coast. There'll be a special one-night screening Friday night at the Commune Resort in Greenmount. Pete Townend, thanks for joining us here on ABC Coast FM. Mate, I'll take you out with a bit of this. It's Midnight Oil and Surf's Up Tonight.
Appropriately.
I know it's a bit predictable. ABC Coast FM, 7 to 7 news is on the way. We'll check the traffic just before that for you.
Nice one.
Nice.